They said he was a fool the moment he laid the first log, not because of the size or the shape or even the method he was using to raise the frame, but because of where he'd placed the windows. A mountain man didn't need windows, not like that. Not wide, not open, not facing west. That side caught the brunt of winter storms. It caught snow, it caught wind, and it brought in sunlight when a man least needed it, or so the others thought. But Thomas Merton didn't argue. He'd learned not to. Let men laugh. Let them sneer. He had his reasons, though they hadn't been born from wisdom or theory, but from a single, brutal, sleepless winter where cold and darkness had nearly driven him insane. It wasn't how he imagined mountain living would be. Like most men who headed west after the Panic of 1830, Thomas had imagined freedom, solitude, a chance to live on his own terms, away from the press of cities and the debts he could no longer pay. The fur trade was still alive in pockets, and stories circulated of trappers who made small fortunes in a season. He'd learned some woodcraft from his uncle back in the Appalachians, enough to convince himself he'd survive. So he headed west with a rifle, a hatchet, a pair of mules, and a vague idea that he'd build himself a cabin by a stream, catch beaver, and spend his days in peaceful isolation. By November of his first year, he was starving, freezing, and wondering if peace was just another word for slow death. The cabin he'd built was standard: single room, low roofline, tight construction, a small fireplace set against the east wall, and one narrow window tucked up high on the south side. More a vent than a proper view. It had taken him 3 weeks to raise, notched and stacked by hand, mud-packed chinking smeared with his own blood where the hatchet had bit too deep. He was proud of it at first, until the storms came, until the shadows came. He hadn't understood how dark a mountain winter could be. Not just the long nights, though those were bad enough, but the days too. Dim, grey, flickering weak light through the trees like someone shaking a lantern low on oil. The sun never rose high. It skimmed the edge of the ridge, casting blue-tinted light that never seemed to warm. Inside his cabin, it was worse. The narrow window admitted a shaft of light no wider than his arm, and by December, it barely touched the floor. The fireplace gave heat but no cheer. Smoke sometimes backed up into the room, coating the ceiling in soot and making his eyes sting. He found himself sleeping more than he should, napping in daylight, waking at dusk, losing track of time. The silence pressed in. The dimness turned everything into shadow. He began to feel watched, even though he hadn't seen another human in weeks. He couldn't read. He'd brought 2 books, now closed and forgotten. Even carving or mending his gear felt impossible in that gloom. Time stretched. He stopped shaving. He stopped talking aloud. He couldn't tell if it was morning or evening without opening the door, and he hated opening the door, because the moment he did, the cold would slam into him like a hammer. It stole his breath. It made his teeth ache, but even worse was what it whispered. This is how you die. Not by bear or arrow, not by starvation, but slowly, quietly, in the dark. Then came the fox. It was a little thing, half-starved and limping, caught in one of his traps near the creek. He should have killed it for meat, but instead, he brought it back to the cabin, wrapped it in a scrap of blanket, and nursed it. Why? He didn't know. Maybe he just needed something alive in that space. Something with eyes. The fox healed slowly. It didn't trust him, wouldn't eat from his hand, but it stayed. And every morning, it would climb atop a stump near the west-facing wall and stare through the logs at the sliver of sun that glimmered just beyond. That's when he noticed it, the light. Each day, just before sunset, the western sky lit up with a strange fire, a deep gold that bled into crimson and lavender, painting the mountains with a warmth his cabin never knew. That glow struck the wall like a silent miracle. It didn't last more than 10 minutes, but in those minutes, the whole room softened, shadows retreated, the fox would lift its head, and Thomas would feel something like hope return to his chest. He began waiting for it, then longing for it, then needing it. But the logs blocked most of it. The west wall was solid. Why wouldn't it be? Everyone said never to put windows on the west side. You'd lose heat, invite snow, risk storms. But one evening, driven by impulse and desperation, Thomas grabbed his axe and carved a hole through the west-facing logs. At first it was crude, a rough square, no more than a foot wide, barely framed. Wind poured in, snow dusted the floor. But the light came in too, not just at sunset. Mid-afternoon sun began to stream in, reflecting off the snowy ridge, bouncing golden warmth into the cabin like a gift from the heavens. The effect was immediate. The air didn't get warmer, not yet, but he did, inside. He began talking again, shaving, cleaning. He repaired the roof. He re-tarred the chinking. He slept less, ate more, and the fox moved closer to the fire. He didn't understand it at the time, but later he'd describe it as the window that saved my mind. When spring finally broke through, He tore down the whole west wall and rebuilt it with 2 large windows, framed and shuttered with split log slabs. He collected river stones, built proper sills, and added canvas rolls he could drop over the glassless openings during storms. Other trappers laughed when they saw it, called him soft, called it stupid, said he was building a church or a lookout, not a cabin, said it was the dumbest thing they'd ever seen. He didn't care, because that summer, when he rebuilt the entire structure, he designed everything around light, heat, too, but mostly light. He realized most mountain cabins were built like burrows, defensive, hidden, dark. But he wasn't a groundhog. He was a man, and men needed light to live. The new cabin was larger, still single room, but with higher ceilings and 4 windows, 2 on the west, 1 on the south, and a small one high up on the east wall for morning light. The door faced north to block the wind. The fireplace, rebuilt from scratch, stood in the center rather than against a wall, allowing radiant heat to circulate. But the windows were the heart of it. He angled their placement based on how the sun moved over the valley. He built shallow eaves to shield them from high summer glare, while allowing deep winter light to flood in low and strong. People called it a luxury, a waste, a joke. But then came the blizzard of 1836. It swept through the range like a monster with frozen claws. Dozens of camps were snowed in. 2 trappers died of exposure. 1 was found half frozen beside a collapsed lean-to. The cold was so deep it split pine trees like firecrackers. Winds tore roofs from cabins. Doors jammed with frost. Fires couldn't keep up. And in that brutal week, men remembered Thomas Merton's foolish cabin. Because he was the only one with daylight inside. He could see to cook, see to read. He stayed warm because the sun helped heat his stones, helped warm his walls. The light lifted his spirits, gave him purpose. And when 2 half-frozen men stumbled into his clearing begging for shelter, he had the space and sanity to take them in. That week changed how mountain men looked at shelter. Not overnight, not loudly, but over time, men began cutting their own west-facing openings, smaller at first, experimental, but then wider, with shutters, with stone sills, and eventually a quiet understanding spread through the range. Maybe the fool hadn't been so foolish after all, but none of that mattered to Thomas, because for him it had never been about proving anything. It had been about survival, not of the body, but of the mind. He'd stared too long into the dark that first winter. He'd felt it licking at the edges of his soul, whispering lies, eating away at his will, and he'd realized something no manual ever taught. A cabin isn't just for keeping out the cold, it's a shelter from despair, and that meant letting in light, sunlight, warmth, visibility, and all the hope that came with it. And so, when the next winter came, and he sat by his central hearth with the fox curled near his feet, and gold light spilled in through those stupid windows, Thomas smiled. The mountain hadn't changed. The cold was just as sharp, the snow just as deep, but inside his home it was bright, it was warm, and it was his. The story of Thomas Merton's windows didn't spread like wildfire. It moved slow, through cold trails and whiskey-touched conversations around campfires, growing not by force but by quiet repetition. At the spring rendezvous near the Green River, traders mocked it at first. They called it Merton's Picture House, laughed when they heard about his big west-facing openings, and said it was only a matter of time before a snow squall filled his cabin waist-deep. They expected to hear news of him freezing to death in his sleep, but instead the reports were different, curious, grudgingly respectful. "Old Tom made it through the storm without lighting a fire till midday," one man said. "Had 2 men with him too, and they didn't look half-starved." It wasn't a brag, it was a statement, and those kinds of statements carried weight out there, where winters judged every choice a man made. Still, Thomas didn't think of himself as a teacher. He didn't draw plans or offer sermons. When men came through his valley, he'd offer coffee if he had it, show them around the cabin if they asked, answer questions if they were honest. Most just wanted to see it, to stand in a room where daylight lived. Some made remarks, quiet, embarrassed comments about how it felt different, how they didn't have to squint, how it reminded them of homes they'd left behind in Tennessee or Pennsylvania or the Shenandoah. Few admitted outright they were going to copy it, but a year later, Thomas heard stories of cabins with storm shutters, or day holes, terms men used to mask the fact they were following his lead. The truth was, most trappers didn't build for longevity. Their shelters were often temporary, single-season outposts thrown together to serve as bases during the trapping months. They weren't meant to last, much less to be comfortable. Men like Thomas, who stayed in one place year after year, were rare, and that gave him the strange freedom to experiment. He wasn't rebuilding each fall, he was refining, adapting. It was during his third winter that he began to realize how much those small refinements mattered. That year, the snow came early. October the 20th brought a deep, cold snap that froze his water barrels solid. The wind shifted hard out of the north, and he could hear trees popping like musket shots on the ridges above. He'd planned ahead, had over 20 cords of wood split and stacked, more than enough by normal standards. His stores were deep: smoked venison, dried apples, even a small keg of molasses he'd traded for with a passing wagon team. He'd gathered extra insulation material too: moss, dried grass, old canvas. Still, the cold tested everything. What saved him again was the light. The sun tracked lower through the sky as the weeks passed, and the angle of the west-facing windows caught it perfectly. He'd cut the sills to slant slightly inward, a detail learned from a book of farming designs he'd once traded a skin for. That small slant reflected the golden light deeper into the room. He watched the sun crawl across the floor each afternoon, watched it touch his stacked pelts, his boots, the fox's resting spot, the edges of his bed. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of the outside world moving, marking time, even when all else seemed locked in ice. That mattered more than he could explain. One night around mid-December, a sound woke him. He sat up, ears tuned. There, again, a crunch of snow outside the cabin. Not the soft, settling sound of falling flakes, but the deliberate press of weight. Something was walking. He grabbed his rifle from its hooks, crept to the door. The windows were dark now, shutters drawn, but he had left one of the canvas covers rolled slightly open for ventilation. He looked out and saw a shape, a man, slumping, staggering. Thomas unbarred the door and stepped into the cold. The figure collapsed, not 10 feet from his threshold. He dragged the man inside, stripped off the frozen layers, wrapped him in blankets by the fire. It was a young trapper, barely 20 by the look of him, cheeks raw with windburn, hands blackening at the fingertips from frostbite. He was delirious, spoke of a partner lost 2 days prior, a broken snowshoe, a wrong turn, a last-ditch effort to find smoke or shelter. Thomas spooned him broth and didn't ask questions. He knew the look, knew how quickly the mountains could decide a man's fate. By dawn, the trapper could sit up. He looked around the cabin with wide eyes. "It's warm," he said, "and bright." Thomas just nodded. The boy, his name was Eli Chambers, stayed for a week, helped stack more firewood once he regained strength, patched a few boot seams in exchange for meals. He asked about the cabin often, why the chimney wasn't on an outside wall, why the windows were so big, why the shutters angled the way they did. Thomas answered each question plainly: heat retention, passive solar, radiant warming, words he'd half learned from old books, half invented from trial and error. Before Eli left, he stood in the doorway with a quiet expression. "My father always said men didn't need comfort to be tough," he said. "But this don't feel like softness, feels like strength with brains." Thomas didn't say anything, just handed him a bundle of dried meat and pointed down the trail. A month later, Thomas heard that Eli had helped build a new cabin upriver with another trapper. 2 west-facing windows, central hearth, small vents near the roofline. The style was spreading. Not everyone accepted it. Some still held firm to the old ways. Called light a luxury, said windows were for city folk, said a mountain man should thrive in the dark, not run from it. But as years passed, more cabins began to change. One summer, a merchant passing through stopped to trade. He brought a pamphlet, a crudely printed sheet from some frontier builder, offering new techniques for alpine housing. Among the drawings, a sketch of a cabin with wide windows facing west, shutters angled for light, a centrally placed hearth. The caption beneath read, "Improved design for warmth and mental fortitude, Merton method." Thomas stared at it a long while, then folded it into the back of his journal. He wasn't flattered, just satisfied. Not for fame, but because he knew what it meant. Somewhere a man would survive the winter, not just with a warm body but with an unbroken spirit, because of a change in how he built 4 walls. Still, the mountains never stopped testing. The winter of '39 brought the coldest January Thomas had ever recorded. Temperatures dropped to 30 below for 5 straight nights. Snowdrifts climbed higher than the eaves. The fox, now grey around the muzzle and slower in her steps, rarely left the hearth. Ice crystals formed inside, even on the warmest days. That was when the window failed. It happened on the 3rd night. Wind found a seam in the shutter frame. Snow blew in sideways, coating the sill. In minutes, the cold was seeping across the floor like a tide. Thomas jumped from his bed, sealing the breach, stuffing canvas and fur into the edges. He checked the interior. The hearth still held heat, but the difference was clear. One failure in the seal, and the system began to unravel. It rattled him more than he admitted. He sat by the fire until morning, staring at the shutter, thinking about everything he'd built. Was it folly, after all? Had he merely tricked himself into believing that light was enough? Then the sun rose. The moment its rays hit the west ridge and poured through that patched window, he knew he'd been right. The brightness banished the shadows. The temperature inside rose degree by degree. The fox lifted her head and sniffed the air. He rebuilt the shutter better that spring, lined it with leather, reinforced the edges with salvaged metal strapping from a broken trap. That summer, when a group of settlers passed through, heading farther west, they camped nearby for 3 days. One of the women asked to see the cabin. She stepped inside, looked at the sunlight dancing across the wood floor, the way the space felt alive. "It's like a lantern," she said. "Not a cabin, a lantern in the wilderness." Thomas liked that. He never claimed to be an inventor. He never drew plans. But in the years that followed, dozens of cabins across the Wind River and into the Rockies began to adopt pieces of his design, sometimes just a west-facing opening, sometimes the whole blueprint. They never called it his method, but he recognized it every time he passed through a new valley and saw glass glinting on the western wall of a stranger's cabin. Still, one trial remained, one final storm that would test every lesson he'd ever learned. And it came not in winter, but in the heat of a terrible, burning summer. The summer of 1840 began like any other, with long stretches of mild sun and the valley floor coming alive in green. Wildflowers bloomed in riotous bursts across the meadows. Bees hummed near the water's edge, and the snowmelt from the ridges kept the streams full and clear. Thomas Merton had begun work on a small storage shed that spring, cutting and seasoning logs early to avoid the sap issues that plagued hasty builders. His cabin stood firm, now in its 6th full year of standing watch over the clearing. It had survived windstorms, cold snaps, and a minor avalanche from a ridge slide. His stupid windows had gone through 4 redesigns, each more refined than the last, and his confidence in the system had only deepened. But that confidence was about to be tested in a way no cold could match. By late June, the air began to feel different, still and heavy. Thunderheads gathered almost daily, low and bloated on the horizon. Rumbles echoed from mountain to mountain, but no rain fell. The wind shifted from the cool northern breaths of spring to a dry, scorching gust out of the south. Even the animals moved differently, less visible, slower. The fox stayed beneath the porch most days, panting, only venturing out in the early dawn hours. Thomas's creek, which had always run true even during mild droughts, began to thin. By July, the rocky bed glimmered more than it flowed, and the fish disappeared. Then came the smoke. It arrived on the wind, faint at first, just a scent, wood smoke, but not from any cook fire. It was older, thicker, with a tang of pitch and dust. It clung to the back of the throat and made the eyes water. Thomas climbed a ridge behind his cabin to get a clearer view, and what he saw turned his blood cold. To the southwest, a black wall of haze stretched for miles, hanging low over the hills. It moved with the wind like a living thing. Somewhere beyond, deep in the timber country, a wildfire raged unchecked, and it was moving. In town, if one could call the loose settlement of 4 cabins and a trading post 20 miles east a town, word had already spread. The fire had started from Lightning, 2 valleys over, and now fed on thousands of acres of bone-dry pine. There were no fire breaks out here, no organized crews, no pumps, just wind, trees, and flame. Thomas rode back that day hard and fast. At the cabin, he took stock. His clearing was decent, surrounded on 3 sides by meadows, with only one flank exposed to dense timber. But that flank worried him. Fire could leap, sparks could ride winds for miles, and everything around him, his woodpile, his shed, the cabin itself, was fuel. He worked for 3 days straight, dug a trench around the cabin perimeter, cleared brush, moved the firewood 50 yards downslope, and covered it with wet canvas, soaked every log wall he could reach with creek water, carrying bucket after bucket. He cut a firebreak downslope through the pines, hacking and dragging limbs until his hands blistered. The smoke thickened daily, casting a red filter over the sun. Ash began to fall in soft flurries. The air grew hotter than any mountain summer he'd ever known, and still the fire had not arrived. Then one night it did. It came not as a wall of flame, but as a sky of embers. The wind shifted hard after midnight, and with it came the roar, a sound like 1,000 waterfalls, low and thundering, growing louder with each hour. By dawn, The eastern sky glowed with an unnatural orange. Birds fled in panicked flocks. Animals ran blindly through the clearing. Even the fox, ever cautious, bolted into a dugout Thomas had half forgotten behind the shed. The fire crested the ridge at noon. It moved fast, faster than anyone would believe unless they'd seen it. Trees exploded into torches. Ground brush ignited like tinder. Sparks leapt high, carried by wind gusts that gusted strong enough to bend saplings sideways. Thomas stood in his clearing, hose in hand, face wrapped in wet cloth, watching as flame licked the tree line just beyond his western field. And it was in that moment, at the edge of panic, that he faced the true test of his design. The windows, those open, glassless, west-facing portals, so praised for their light, their warmth, their ability to change a man's soul, now posed a threat. If the fire breached the clearing, they'd funnel heat and ash straight into the cabin. Shutters wouldn't be enough, but Thomas had planned for this too. Not fire exactly, but wind. Back in the early days, he'd devised a system to close the shutters and seal them with mud in storm conditions. He'd practiced it for blizzards, not flame, but it would have to do. He moved quickly, dropped the shutters, packed mud over the seams, nailed wet hides across the interiors. Then he went inside and waited. The fire never reached his cabin. It burned around the meadow's edge, scorching the tall grass and lighting a few shrubs. A pine at the far end of the clearing went up, its sap hissing and cracking like a musket volley. But the fire didn't take the field. Wind shifted again, just enough. Rain, thin and miraculous, began to fall by nightfall. Steam hissed from scorched earth. The roar faded. When dawn came, Thomas emerged to find the world changed. Blackened trunks stood like soldiers on the ridges. Ash blanketed everything. The air still stank of pitch and death. But his cabin stood untouched. The shutters had held. No ash inside, no scorched logs. The fox crawled from the dugout and sniffed the air, then trotted inside like it had always belonged there. He sat by the hearth that morning, exhausted, light spilling through the one window he'd dared leave slightly ajar for ventilation. The gold beam cut through the smoky haze like a promise, and in that light, he saw clearly. The windows had saved him again, not just from darkness, not just from cold, but from isolation, fear, and now from the flame itself. Word of the fire traveled slowly, but it traveled. When men finally made their way back through the valleys, when the air cleared and the ash settled, they stopped at his place to ask what he'd done to survive. And again they saw the windows, wide, angled, deliberate. They asked about the shutters, the mud seal, the hides, and again he showed them, spoke plain, answered their questions, and again they listened. That fall, Thomas helped a group of young settlers build a new cabin 3 valleys over. They were from Ohio, green, eager, and more used to farming than frontier survival. He showed them how to place the windows not just for heat, but for safety, how to vent heat, how to shut out fire. He watched them build, corrected them gently, saw their faces change when they stepped inside and felt what light could do. One of them asked, "Did you come up with all this yourself?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I just got tired of being cold, tired of feeling like a rat in a box, started looking for ways to live better. That was all." By the next year, people started calling the style Clearview cabins, a term picked up by traders moving north, a way to describe the strange mountain dwellings with big west-facing windows, central hearths, an airflow design that seemed smarter than their neighbors. The name wasn't his. He never claimed ownership, but he recognized the shape, the soul of it. It was his. He kept building. A second structure, half size, as a smokehouse, then a storage cabin with the same window logic. He began writing notes, sketches, scribbles in the margins of his old books, ideas for louvered shutters, canvas diffusers, reflective sills. He wasn't trying to create a system, but he couldn't help refining. He began to see his cabin less as a home and more as a message, a working theory, a living proof that a man didn't need to suffer to be strong. One spring, a trapper brought news that a builder in Missouri had begun selling prefabricated shutters based on the Mountain Man design. Said he heard it from someone who'd passed through a place with the warmest damn cabin I ever stepped foot in. Thomas laughed, not out of pride, but from the sheer absurdity of it, that his strange, criticized window placements were now a design feature back east. He still didn't think of himself as special. He chopped wood, hunted, repaired tools, nursed the aging fox when she caught her paw in a trap, grew herbs in a small box near the window, watched sunsets through the very hole he'd once hacked in despair. He rarely spoke of the first winter, the darkness, the silence, but he never forgot it, because everything he'd built, everything others now copied, had come from that place, the worst place. And what came next would test him again, but differently. Not a fire, not a blizzard, but a man, a desperate man, seeking shelter, bringing trouble Thomas had long thought he'd left behind. It was the second week of September when the man appeared, shuffling into the clearing with a limp and eyes like glass. He wore a filthy duster, the left sleeve torn clear through, and he carried nothing but a battered satchel slung over one shoulder. His face was hidden beneath a thick growth of beard, and the way he moved told Thomas more than words could have. This wasn't a trader, this wasn't a passing trapper. This was a man running from something. Thomas had been in the woods that morning, checking a series of snares along the creek when he spotted smoke, his own chimney, curling neat and slow into the blue sky. But there was something wrong with the smell. The wood was his, yes, but it burned hotter than normal, faster. Whoever was inside didn't understand the way he managed the fire, the balance of kindling to hardwood. He moved fast, low through the brush, circling wide until he reached the blind rise behind the storage shed. From there he watched. The door was open, not kicked in, no signs of a fight. The man had entered the cabin like a guest. Thomas stepped into the clearing slow, his rifle in hand, not raised but ready. He called out. Inside the cabin, there was a pause, long enough to grow dangerous. Then the man stepped into the doorway. He raised both hands slowly and leaned against the frame like his knees might give out. I needed a place to warm up, the man said. Saw the smoke from the ridge. Thomas studied him. He wasn't young, but not old either. Hard miles. His boots were near ruined, one sole flapping. His lips were cracked from sun and wind, but it was his eyes that made Thomas uneasy. Too still, too distant. He lowered the rifle, not fully, and motioned toward the stool near the porch. You can sit, the man nodded, eased down with a grunt. And for a while they said nothing, just sat, listened to the wind in the grass and the last chirps of crickets as autumn settled into the bones of the land. After a time the man spoke. Name's Cooper. Been walking since Rawlins. Worked a herd down there. Trouble came. I left. He didn't say what kind of trouble. Thomas didn't ask. He knew the kind of men who found themselves alone in the high country in late fall with no gear. They weren't always the guilty ones, but they weren't often innocent either. Still, a man didn't last long in these parts by turning away every stranger. Thomas gave him water, then coffee, then stew. The man ate like a dog, fast and quiet. When he finished, he wiped his mouth on the back of his sleeve and stared at the cabin's west wall, where late afternoon light streamed through the angled windows. You built this? Thomas nodded. It's warm, Cooper said. Too warm for the outside air. That's the idea, Cooper chuckled. Seems I've been living wrong. Thomas let the silence settle, then asked, how long you planning to stay? The man looked away. Till I can walk right again. Thomas watched him, saw the way his eyes flicked toward the tree line, toward the road he must have come from. The man was watching for someone, or something. And just like that, the peace he'd spent 6 winters building was in danger. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He watched the fire burn low, then added wood with care so it wouldn't flare too high. Cooper lay on the floor in front of the hearth, wrapped in a spare blanket. He slept deep, too deep for a man on the run. The next day, Thomas checked the ridge for tracks. He found 3 sets, 2 days old, heavy boots, deep prints. At least 2 men, maybe 3. They'd come through fast, no sign of camping. They'd passed his trail and moved north. Trouble, moving slow now, but not far behind. Thomas returned to the cabin and began to prepare. He didn't ask Cooper for the truth, didn't press. It didn't matter. The problem wasn't what the man had done, it was what was following him. And Thomas knew one thing for certain. If men showed up in that clearing looking to settle something, there'd be no reasoning with them. He checked the shutters, secured the door bar, moved the fox into the shed, packed what food he could carry into a satchel, and set it by the back window. Then he waited. On the 3rd night, they came. 3 men, no words, just the shuffle of boots and the glint of steel in the moonlight. Thomas heard them before he saw them, one approaching from the front, 2 circling wide. They didn't call out, no demands, just the silence of certainty. They were here to kill. Thomas woke Cooper with a hand on his shoulder. They're here. The man shot up, panic in his eyes. Thomas pressed a rifle into his arms, handed him a pouch of shot. You can shoot? Cooper nodded, stiff. Good. Don't open the shutters. Fire from the ports. Thomas had carved them years ago, slim openings high on the west wall, cut at angles that gave him coverage without exposure. Stupid window placement, they'd called it. But those same placements now gave him a field of fire and control over the interior temperature with 0 blind spots. The first man came up the porch. Thomas didn't shoot. He waited. The second man moved near the north window. Thomas fired once, sharp and fast. The glassless port gave a clean shot. The man cried out and fell back. The third took cover behind a tree. Then the shouting started. Hand him over! Ain't gotta be you too! Thomas didn't answer. You're harboring a killer! Still no answer. Inside, Cooper crouched by the hearth, white-knuckled on the stock of the rifle. "He's a snake," Thomas said low. "Don't believe his talk." "But they're not here for truth." They waited. The men didn't rush, just circled, testing, like wolves. But Thomas knew his cabin. He'd built it for light, for warmth, for survival. And survival meant defense too. Thick logs, reinforced corners, overlapping joints, windows placed not where tradition dictated, but where necessity proved. The design that let in the sun now shielded him from it. The firefight was short. They tried to flush him with flame, lobbed a torch toward the porch. But the porch roof was stone, covered in sod. The torch sputtered, died. Thomas returned fire. One man dropped, another fled. The last ran. Cooper wanted to chase. Thomas stopped him. "Not our place. Let the hills deal with him." When dawn came, the clearing stank of gunpowder and fear. 2 men lay dead. Thomas buried them with hands that no longer shook. He didn't ask Cooper what he'd done. It didn't matter now. The man left 2 days later. Said nothing more than, "Thank you." Left his satchel. Inside it was a letter, unopened, addressed to someone named Eliza. Thomas didn't read it, burned it that night. Let the flames eat the words. Let the light of the fire be enough. That winter he rebuilt the ports, made them cleaner, faster to seal. He added a second layer of canvas to the shutters, reinforced the roofline with riverstone, and built a cold trap trench along the foundation to deflect wind. Each change came not from fear, but from clarity. He understood now that the cabin wasn't a refuge just from cold, or loneliness, or flame. It was a bastion against whatever the world sent his way, built not from stubbornness, but wisdom, built with care, with light, with forethought, with deliberate, intelligent placement. The years passed. Visitors still came, traders, young couples, families heading west. One boy, no older than 12, walked through the cabin and stared at the way the sunset lit the walls. "Feels like a church," he whispered. Thomas smiled, not because he agreed, but because he knew the boy was seeing it. The light, the warmth, the point. They called him eccentric, yes, but then they called him brilliant, then simply wise. Other cabins took cues, other builders asked questions, and in the final years of his life, when Thomas sat in his chair, Fox at his feet, fire burning low, he understood what he'd really built. A way of thinking, a way of living, not just in timber and stone, but in design, in rejecting inherited mistakes, in placing a window not where a book said, but where the sun told him it should go. Because sometimes the stupidest thing a man can do, at least in the eyes of others, is to think for himself, and the last test of his design would come in the form of a cruel and sudden injury, a fall that left him trapped in his own cabin, unable to walk, no help in sight, no neighbors near, only the sun and the cabin he'd built to outlast the cold. It happened in late October, during what Thomas had always called the golden lull, that brief stretch between the last warmth of autumn and the first teeth of winter, when the woods turned quiet, the days sat crisp but not yet cruel, and the world seemed to hold its breath before the snow came. He'd gone out to split a fresh load of wood, same as he had every season for over a decade. The axe was sharp, his hands sure. He remembered the way the air smelled, distant pine smoke, leaf mold, the faint sweetness of frost on dry grass. He remembered swinging the axe twice, clean and steady, before the handle caught a knot in the round, jolted back, and threw his balance. Off. He fell wrong. Not hard, not far, just wrong. A twist of the foot, a crack, a scream he hadn't heard from his own throat in 20 years. When he tried to stand, his right leg refused to bear weight. The world spun. He vomited from the pain. He crawled back to the cabin on elbows and grit, dragging the ruined limb like dead weight through mud and brittle grass. By the time he made it to the threshold, the sun was dipping, and his hands were raw. He knew immediately the break was bad. The bone hadn't punched through, but it had shifted, swollen fast. Every movement sent waves of agony from heel to skull. He braced it as best he could with a pair of split shingles and leather wraps, but the pain never receded, and he couldn't stand, couldn't reach the outhouse, could barely stoke the fire. He was trapped. The first night, he sweated and shivered in equal measure, sprawled on the floor like a fallen animal. He stared at the ceiling and thought of wolves, of how many days it would take before one sniffed the blood, the weakness. He thought of how few people knew he was here, of how long it would take before someone came looking, if ever. But then the light came. Even in pain, even half-conscious, he noticed it. The sunrise hit the east port, not a big beam, not like the west light, but enough to shift the room from nightmare into clarity. The shapes of his tools emerged. The hearthstone glowed faint, and with that light came a thought, small and almost ridiculous. This cabin was built to keep you alive, so let it. He began to move with purpose. In the hours when the light poured in, he worked, crawled across the floor to drag firewood near the hearth, pulled pelts into a pile for bedding, used a coal hook to pull the stew pot within reach. Everything hurt, but the pain had shape, meaning. His mind stayed sharp because the light stayed strong. Every afternoon, when the west windows lit up, it was like someone throwing open the door of a prison. Warmth seeped in, shadows retreated, and he could see, he could act. The cabin gave him more than shelter. It gave him hours, hours of motion, of control. Without them, the dark would have swallowed him whole. Not just the cold, but the weight of helplessness, the thought of lying in shadows for days, waiting to rot. But instead, he moved, he planned, he rationed, he kept himself alive. On the 5th day, a storm rolled through. Heavy wind, early snow. It caught in the shutters, slammed them against the walls. He crawled, dragging his leg, using his arms like oars through mud. He sealed the cracks, dropped the canvas shades, packed spare pelts against the seams. When the wind howled, the cabin held. But by the 7th day, the food ran low. He hadn't stored enough within arm's reach. The root cellar was 15 feet outside, across a stretch of earth now covered in snow and ice. No crutches, no help, and no option. That afternoon, as the sun angled low and fired gold through the windows, he pulled himself to the door, opened it. The cold was knife-sharp, but the light had already warmed the cabin's core. His muscles still held strength. He used his arms to reach the edge of the porch, then dropped into the snow, crawled inch by inch. His breath fogged the air, every gasp a furnace. He reached the root cellar just before dusk. Inside, he found potatoes, dried apples, smoked strips of venison, enough to last another week. He loaded what he could into a sack, tied it around his chest, and dragged himself back. When he fell asleep that night, the fire was crackling. The cabin was bright with reflected snowlight, and for the first time since the injury, he dreamed of spring. He did not die. By the 10th day, the pain dulled. The swelling receded. He fashioned a crutch from an old broom handle and a thick branch, binding it with hide. He stood for the first time on the 12th day, wobbly but upright. His legs screamed but held, and when he looked around the cabin, its beams golden in the morning light, its hearth radiating warmth, its windows catching the last burn of the sunset, he knew it wasn't luck that saved him. It was light and design. He wrote it down that night, scrawled into the back of a torn ledger. A cabin is not just a shelter. It is the body's skin when weather turns cruel. It is the mind's lantern when shadows press in. Every board speaks, every joint matters. Place the windows where they catch, not just the sun, but the soul. He signed it, T. Merton. The fox died that winter. Old age curled beside the hearth, quiet and still. He buried her out near the rise behind the shed, where the light struck longest at dusk. He built a small marker, just a stone, no words. Then he sat on the porch and watched the wind roll the snow in slow, silent waves. Years passed. The cabin stood. People came, took notes, asked questions. Some didn't understand, thought the windows were foolish, said it let in too much heat in summer, too much cold in winter. But more understood. They saw the balance, the harmony, the way the structure breathed with the land, not against it. They saw a man's thoughts carved into timber, a philosophy in the grain. Thomas died in that cabin, peaceful, alone, but not lonely. He was found 3 days later by a young family heading west. They buried him under the fox's tree, built a small fence around the grave, left the cabin untouched, and for years after, it remained. People stayed in it, tended it, repaired the roof, oiled the shutters, swept the hearth. They marveled at how warm it stayed in the cold, how cool it remained in the heat, how light filled it like a second fire. And every time someone asked why the windows faced the way they did, someone else would smile and say, "He put them there so a man wouldn't lose his soul in the dark."